Deobfuscation or CTF that ends at the end of this talk. If you are going to the 23B after party, what time should they be there, Arclight?
I would say any time from 6 o'clock on is fine.
Okay, so
until forever.
The after party is at the 23B shop. You could find the address online or talk to this gentleman after his talk. He has lots of business cards. If you'd like to write it down, it is 418 East Commonwealth, number 1, Fullerton, California, 92832. And it's shop.23b.org. Coming up next is John Norman with Enterprise IT on the Cheap.
Oh, good. Is this on mute? All right. Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. So this is something I put together. I realize a lot of us are, obviously in hacker ways to do stuff on a shoestring. A little bit about me. My day job, I work for a company called Advanced Systems Group, and we're one of the sponsors this year. I do a lot of work spend time going all over Southern California and beyond, basically helping customers with enterprise IT stuff, typically storage, backup recovery, DR, networking solutions. And one of the things that comes up from time to time, both in our personal lives, we want to build a lab, we've got something we need to do, we have our brother-in-law that videos weddings and has 100 terabytes of data he needs to protect, and we can't really offer them the kind of solutions that we might want to offer our customers. So I came up with a little presentation just to kind of give you an overview of kind of some of my tricks I've picked up along the way, whether you're building your pen testing lab or your hacker space, or you're setting up your father-in-law's business with 10 point-of-sale terminals. This is some stuff that might help you. So a little about why we're doing this. This is not a complete how to IT or how to internet. I'm leaving a lot of holes, and I'm probably not going to cover your favorite pet solution, product, open source solution. These are just some of the ones that I know that have worked for me. With that being said, let's kind of go into this. So first, a few definitions. When we talk about enterprise hardware and software, I put it in broadly categorized solutions into two categories. Enterprise, which would be stuff intended for large-scale deployment, very robust, and consumer, stuff mostly designed for low price point to hit what we call the SOHO, the small office, home office, or consumer market. What is the difference between that? These products have specs sometimes that are very similar. They're sold, by some of the same vendors. What we do, a few of you people have seen my talk about hardware reverse engineering. We take apart things, we look at what's inside. Well, the most striking difference when you start on something is, if you take one of these units apart, you'll see the build quality typically on enterprise gear is a little different. You're going to see capacitors and power supplies that are oversized. They're rated to work, not die even with, let's say one or more of the fans out. Typically designed for 100% duty cycle. The rated specs are the rated specs. They're often very conservative as far as power, cooling. The number of packets per second is not under ideal conditions. Sometimes it's under a typical sampling of their customers' conditions, depending on the vendor. You're going to see a lot of hardware and software, and especially firmware testing that's happened. A lot of these vendors make stuff that's very large in carrier class, so everything down to even their mid-size gear is really well tested and baked. You're also going to see interesting features like hardware watchdogs. So how many of you have been in a coffee shop and the internet doesn't work? And the poor barista lady has to reset it and mess with it 3 or 4 times a day. And you go to Starbucks, does that ever really happen to you unless the whole place is down? It's a lot less frequent. That's kind of the difference between, it's how much intervention is needed. Do they mend themselves? Is there alerting that makes stuff get fixed quickly? And generally, we have a focus on ease of use for consumer gear. You have, GUIs and wizards. Enterprise gear may have that, but there's typically also a fairly robust command line interface that will let you do things when you need to go off the reservation or outside of the quick start. And a couple more things. We have products with a very long product life cycle. So if you put in a solution now, it's likely to be supportable with the same product or one that's more or less drop-in replacement 3 or 5 years from now. Of course, with all this, these products are expensive. Some of our vendors, this is just a very small handful of stuff you see at companies, right? Cisco Networks, Aruba, they make wireless gear. NetApp, I would consider NetApp and Hitachi Data Systems tier 1 storage vendors. HP does a little of everything. Most of it's tier 1, some of it's not quite tier 1. Dell, they have some tier 1, down to consumer as well. But more or less, these are companies that have been around a long time that offer, on-site and, contracted remote support, all sorts of things like that. Our consumer products, sometimes they are very similar to the enterprise products, and they even use some of the same chips or, Linux kernel. But typically, they've intentionally locked out features because they want you to upgrade at some point to the expensive enterprise version. They may also just lock things out to keep you from hurting yourself. And there's often no CLI or a limited feature set deliberately. These type of products are more subject to mysterious crashes, what I call heat deaths also. Classic things, you have a switch, a router, a firewall, stuff like that in a closet that's closed. And at some point they start dropping packets, you reset it, sometimes they work again, sometimes they don't. And eventually it just gets cooked and you never know why. That doesn't seem to happen so much with enterprise stuff, just design and features around it. Another thing about the product lifecycle, they may very well find a cheaper vendor to supply it and quit making it themselves. So your favorite particular brand of Soho router may get discontinued, and it may get replaced with something that has a completely different hardware and software stack, and all of your customization and scripts you managed to hack to make work may never be available again. This is really it's one thing to have this happen with network gear, which is fairly interchangeable. This is really a problem with storage that has all of your life on it. Big advantage though, it's cheap, right? You can buy this at Best Buy or Fry's or wherever, and it'll get you going. I put all of these vendors in here. Belkin is now Linksys. If you want to know where Linksys is left off, they got acquired by Belkin a couple years ago. Asus has been moving into the cheap and cheerful small office, home office market. TP-Link is a company out of Taiwan. Their main advantage to hackers is that they have some products that are really easy to break into and redo the firmware because of these well-documented chipsets. And then, of course, we've had to deal with Netgear. That's the purple switch that's hiding in every office somewhere doing something important when we find it malfunctioning. So what are we trying to do? When we talk about wanting to have something that looks like a robust, enterprise-grade network, I think, what do we have at work? Or if we work for, a place with money, how would they do that? What kind of services do we want to offer, whether it's for ourselves, for our lab, maybe it's for a hacker space, maybe you're setting something up for, the Boys and Girls Club, whatever it happens to be, your university. The first thing to do, we always like to get, go down the road of, this is cool tech, I want this tech. But we really have to stop and think, what are we trying to do? If your goal is to make CAD drawings and occasionally internet and write letters, your needs are a lot different than someone who needs to edit 4K video. And chances are the solutions that are appropriate for one are overkill or not appropriate for another. Bottom line though is needs should get defined and they should drive software choices. And software is what we are ultimately deploying hardware and networks and all that stuff to support. Nobody buys a drill necessarily because they want to drill, they buy it because they need some holes. So we should think in terms of our end state, what we want to achieve, or what kinds of things we need to work really well, what kinds of things make us money if we're consulting, what kinds of things make everyone mad if they're down. We just want to, in general, limit our scope. Scope creep kills every kind of project we do in tech. There are nice to haves and there are need to haves. And we should really start with defining our need to haves and finding out what kind of software and what kind of services we need to make that happen, and then start building. So first thing to look at, this is something that happens all the time. You have managers and people at your work that find a magazine, unfortunately, in the men's room and start saying things like cloud, 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 cloud. Really mindlessly without actually having considered the implications of this. We as hackers tend to be very distrustful of things we don't own. And fundamentally, the cloud is just somebody else's computer, right? That being said, we also have to understand that there are things that I would call commodities or jelly beans that everybody else has that problem. Very few people have that problem in such a way that that's the thing that they want to do to make money. It's typically a sideline thing. It's something you have to do the rest of what you do. And somebody else has probably solved it better, faster, and cheaper than you can, or scaled it to 1 million people, and by virtue of that, gotten all the bugs worked out. Things that fall into that category: web hosting and email. How many of you guys have been an Exchange admin or email, manage a large email system? That sucks, right? If there were a way to make a lot of those problems be someone else's problem, would you be able to spend more time doing whatever it is your company does to make money? That's possible. Especially if you're not so big that, or have such a critical security need that it's absolutely unobtainable to have that done by somebody else. If you need to host something like WordPress, well, there are plenty of companies that host millions of WordPress sites, and yeah, it's janky and broken and has engineering limitations in many ways. But someone who hosts 1 million WordPress sites, it's almost guaranteed that the latest 0 day that comes out will hit their first 20,000 customers and then get stopped by even the least competent shop eventually, and probably before it gets to you just by herd immunity. Something else. If you do something that is very specific to an industry, you are doing stuff for a tax preparation office, or maybe a medical center, or a point of sale system perhaps that you have, and you have the option of hosting all yourself and hosting off-site. It may be that by the time you bake in all of the backup recovery, regulatory requirements, what have you, that dental office can get this hosted for $250 a month, and doing it right yourself would be 20 hours of your time plus an initial $25,000 investment. Or it might be something like Adobe Creative Suite, where you can either buy it up front, or you can pay a subscription cost for the features you want. And that kind of cash flow management, or just the ability to not have to think about upgrades or have someone else manage patches and dependencies for you, might be worth it. If it's something that's very specific to an industry, there's may not be a good reason to want to do it yourself. Something to think about. GitHub, if you have a lot of collaboration needs, manage a lot of source code, yes, you can set up VPN and security and trust relationships with contractors and different developers, and you can run your own revision or Git system. Does it make sense to just pay GitHub some money and have that problem go away so that you can go back to writing code, like if that's what you are supposed to be doing for a living? It might very well. You have to value your time at some hourly rate and decide if it's worth it. And licensing models for a lot of these places, if you add up the number of months you pay between upgrades versus the number of free months you get before you have to pay for an upgrade, you may be at even money, and you could have just sidestepped all the work. So first off, when we have that cloud discussion and that offsite or hosted app or whatever, we should realize that some things just absolutely have to live on site. Local file storage. I'm of the opinion that you don't own anything or your company's assets if you don't have a copy of those on site physically under your control, or maybe in a colo or something like that. If everything you own, period, in a story is trusted to someone else, you're also trusting like your accounting person to pay the bill, you're trusting them not to go bankrupt and not tell you, you're putting a lot of trust in other people you have no visibility, whose lives you have no visibility into. So I'm of the opinion that you should always have something, whether it's a primary copy that you work on locally that maybe is backed up somewhere else, or you have a primary copy off-site that's backed up at intervals locally, that you should own a copy of everything that is important to you. In order to use just about anything these days, get anything done, we have to have internets, and we have to have a network that can get us into off-site resources or get us into our home site when we're traveling or remote. Obviously, we have to have security baked into all of this. We have to have the ability to get ourselves securely in, do some basic firewalling and malware and malicious actor protection. Where we set our risk thermostat on that is subject to some debate. And then we have to have very basic things. Even though it's 2015, we still have printing and scanning and documents and various kinds of multimedia, and maybe we have to trade thumb drives and portable hard drives and DVDs with clients and deliver work and stuff like that. So there's stuff that just has to be done on site. I think we all agree with that. When we go back to that, where do we put stuff? Do we do it on-site or off-site? Do we, what are we trying to do? We start with software. Obviously, a lot of us are proponents of open source software, and I am too. I have kind of a use case, sort of a checklist I go through to see, does this make sense? And the first thing I start with, if we look at things like Office applications, stuff like that, there's a recognized standard like Microsoft Office. Is something like 80% interoperability or feature completeness okay? If I edit photos occasionally to change my sandwich board menu, GIMP I'm certain is fine. If I make t-shirts, maybe Inkscape is fine, or maybe I really need a real licensed copy of an Adobe product or something like that. The key is, do I make money with this, or is this some side distraction that I have to deal with in order to do business? And I would argue with, buy the best, fastest, sharpest tools for things that make you money, and consider a little bit more janky or less robust open source solution if it's something that doesn't. It's also your time, right? Is this something that can save me time, or is this something that's even money? When I look at free solutions, I like to start with, is there a mainstream free solution? So something like GIMP or FreeNAS or SmoothWall for firewalls, they have a good user community. They're deployed by hundreds or thousands of people with probably throughout the whole feature stack. If you're looking at 3 different competing Office Suite applications that are all free, I would pick the one that has the best community support and has the highest adoption. It's probably not the best one. WordPresses or Drupal, they are not the best content managers, probably. But there is such a community around them that finding help with something that has no company you can buy a support contract with, perhaps, that might be more important than the absolute engineering and feature completeness of it. But yeah, the key is getting something with a high adoption and lots of easy to search archives and forums and so forth. And that usually means there's also a community of people that you could perhaps hire when you need something done or customized. So commercial software. This is also something we have to deal with. Anything we do that makes us money, that runs on our hardware, some of it somewhere is probably not going to be Creative Commons, no strings attached, or even GPL. We're going to have to deal with plain old closed source commercial software. I'm not opposed to using a blend of both of those. I think we have to remember that when we're building an environment, we're not necessarily making a political statement, we're just trying to get the job done most of the time. We have a variety of things like hypervisors. We have Zen, we have VirtualBox, we have KVS, KVM, we've got probably 5 or 6 others I'm forgetting about. I like VMware myself personally. The reason I like that is that everything can be managed from the CLI. It has its own OS, so I don't have to perhaps burden myself with getting a Microsoft license if I want to run Hyper-V. I don't have to install Red Hat, let's say, and separately patch it. And it has an upgrade bit. It has everything, even in the free version, that can be managed from the command line. So I can do most of the things I would need to do even if they weren't baked into the very limited management tools that come with it, because it has a CLI and scripting and SSH and tools like that we like. Also important, if we think this is something that will grow, or somebody that doesn't have any money now but might in the future, having a path to a full, robust enterprise solution with all the bells and whistles, is there such a path? If there is in my free product, that might sway my decision a little bit. Another thing to look at, we really hate dealing with things like antivirus and security software and stuff like that. Oftentimes it comes bundled with PCs we get, and when that subscription runs out, that never gets updated or renewed, whatever. I'm a fan of looking to maybe those tier 2 and tier 3, those lesser known vendors. A lot of those companies have stuff that the default is a 5-user license, or it's $100 for 1 user and $250 for 10 users. Typically means, again, you have to look at those maybe lesser known solutions. A good one for antivirus, just on the licensing side, there are technical reasons any of these are better or worse, but FPROT will give you a license for everybody on site for a pretty reasonable price, and they don't require the same kind of burdensome management, server and agreement and whatever that maybe some of their bigger competitors do. Smaller vendors have to do this sort of thing to stay competitive. Under the covers, some of our security solutions may be using the same engine. They're just marketed at different price points through different companies. So that's the kind of thing that internet reading forums, word of mouth, you get to find out, that there may be 3 or 4 nominally identical solutions that you can buy in a way that's more favorable to you if you're not a big customer with a lot of purchasing power. The other thing, a lot of our commercial software vendors have free add-ons, meaning if you've already paid for the base OS or some product, you have features that aren't necessarily advertised but just exist and can do very, very powerful things. Emmet from Microsoft. That's a great response and mitigation tool that's available. And it's free. You just have to know to look for it and download it. So ways you can save on software. Again, if we find particular applications we need are just going to be what we need to run our business or to do our testing or lab or whatever, we don't want to buy the whole farm. Application vendors love to sell us stuff. They like to start with the enterprise and the double platinum suite and the site license and the 5 years of support unless you tell them not to. So this kind of requires being an educated consumer. Has anyone ever had to deal with, say, a company like Computer Associates? What do they like to do? They like to sell you a framework, and then they like to sell you, they don't just want to sell you this one thing you want. They want to sell you their entire modular framework, which then, when you get down to it, requires a server, and that server requires a database, and a management server, and a license server, and pretty soon this gets really complex. You may find that there is a point solution that will do what you want. For instance, like HP, rather than buying OpenView, if you have a whole bunch of network nodes you just need to manage the configs, they have something called an intelligent management console that starts at like $1,500 that is just a one-trick pony that just manages network configs, but it does it really well. Or you could also look at a free alternative like Rancid, which is PHP and Perl and small database that can basically back up all of your configurations to Git. But if you didn't know any better, you could easily be spending tens of thousands of dollars on something that's just much bigger and scarier and designed for much larger customers than you need. Also, other stuff is licensed sometimes by the processor, the core, the seat, the user, and it pays to really interrogate those vendors or read through their licensing stuff, which everyone hates doing, to find out what the best way to buy it for you is. Backup software and archiving software are classic for this. They often have a by the agent, meaning like hosts, as well as things like Exchange or SQL or Oracle price, but they also have a by the terabyte price. And if you have a lab with 100 complex machine configurations, that would be hundreds of thousands of dollars in licensing cost. But if you only have 2 terabytes of data, that might only be a couple $1,000s in licensing cost if you purchase it the other way. But you won't necessarily find this out talking to your sales rep unless you really grill them. The other thing, if you are in any way conceivably an academic or nonprofit, companies like Microsoft have very generous deals where it becomes competitive to run something like a Microsoft application, SQL, Data Center Edition Windows, without when there's no way that would have been feasible in a 5-person shop or a nonprofit. They have licensing that's 1 to 10% of the cost of commercial if you're the right kind of customer. And if you are yourself a student or professor, you should inquire at your IT department. They may already have a blanket license that gets you like MSDN educational or free OS and Office Suite upgrades for anyone working for the university. It's good to find out about this stuff. The other thing to think about, whenever we buy things like laptops, you typically get OEM licensing, or you get an appliance of some kind. That's typically a license for like an OS that's locked to that specific hardware. The first thing I recommend anyone do after they decrapify their PC is to get all their licensing docs, scan those into PDFs, and to image everything. Take an image with Clonezilla of all those laptops and network servers, whatever you get that maybe has a configuration generated by a vendor. You can always, I don't know how many people end up buying or rebuying things like laptops because they broke Windows. And now you just made a hardware purchase you didn't need to because you couldn't figure out how to get a legitimate copy of Windows again that didn't cost more than the hardware you bought. So getting proficient with imaging tools, that's another thing too. If you don't have a lot of time in an IT department, you don't fix things at Amazon, you just remake them. And there's no reason we can't be doing that in our homes, in our small office environments, our labs. If something's broken, if we have to spend more than about 30 minutes fixing it, we should just be redeploying it, perhaps. Does anyone else have a cloning or imaging backup tool that they like? Yeah. Clonezilla. Clonezilla is great. Do you usually run it from a thumb drive or from media? How do you run it? Is there anything else free that anyone's found that matches Clonezilla for functionality?
I'd seen a networked solution called Fog Server and a free open Ghost server. So
Ghost networked.
Network storage of the imaging and push it out via like TFTP and stuff like that.
Very good. You guys get some exciting Mexican snack treats. Oh, hope I didn't take out the guy in the jacket there. Okay, very good. Moving on, and these are some of the tools, miraculously. Hardware. So maybe we've decided on a path for some of our hardware. We have decided that perhaps some of our stuff can be done in Linux, some of it requires a real, legit, bona fide Microsoft OS. I don't think piracy is a very good long-term strategy, although it's satisfying in the short term. We've got our stuff. We've got our path picked out. We know what we're going to have to do on site. The next question, hardware. What do we do? If we have a big budget, we just call up our favorite vendor and we order some brand new DL3D G9 servers. We get a new top-of-the-line Arista or Cisco switch. We have the wireless guy come out and string the whole place up with fully managed, Arubas, whatever we like, Ciscos. But since we don't really have that in our house, our hackerspace, we kind of have to be a little scrappier and go out on our own. So the first thing I would argue is we need to spend money where it counts and figure out where we can go cheap because it doesn't really affect our lives. Some strategies for that. So first of all, things like a network core probably are going to cause you long-term misery if you don't do them right the first time. That means maybe getting a managed layer 3 switch from a reputable vendor, even if it's a 4-year-old one, or maybe an Outlier solution. A couple of terms I have for that. So buying 1 or 2 down from the top of the line, there may be the solution you want. Things like Intel CPUs have a dramatic price point reduction when you go a couple down from the top. Things like network switches, when you start to get away from the, I can do BGP and full core routing and maybe I just need simple VLANs, there might be a stripped down model still from a reputable vendor. Or there's the other strategy of getting something that did start out as the most expensive kick-ass top-of-the-line piece of equipment, but it's now 4 or 5 years old. That being said, gigabit networking hasn't changed much, and we might just be fine doing that. Caveats on that. Enterprise software that's tightly coupled to hardware, things like load balancers, some network gear, storage devices. The fine print of how those were sold may dictate that if that hardware changes hands, the licensing is null and void. Whether that affects you, if it's a closed, personal testing lab, it might not. If it's something you'll ever have to get a support or hardware or firmware update done on, it's definitely going to bite you. Enterprise hardware is also typically meant to live in a data center, and it requires care and feeding. It has things like loud fans and expects there to be proper power and cooling and a rack environment. So that might make some of those things a less attractive choice. You may be better off looking at that bottom of the line product from a top line vendor that is made for small office use. Has anyone ever fired up a 1U pizza box server in their home? It sucks, right? You probably have some now heating your living room. Do you have it attached to like an IKEA lac rack? You know that trick? The inside rails are almost exactly 19 inches in all of the IKEA lac brand of products. So if you need a LAN party, 48 ports of switching, you can build it under your coffee table. So another strategy I've come up with is to buy what I call Outlier Solutions. So let's say you have things like the Netgear line that starts at $40 for firewalls and goes to about $300 for their enterprise grade, meaning their less crappy version. Maybe the lowest, Cisco ASA is going to start at $1,200. So what do I do in the middle? Well, it often comes down to there are some vendors out there, some solutions, hardware, software, open source, free, whatever, that are kind of outliers. They perform much, much better than comparable solutions that cost more money. This is a classic thing, like if you buy something like a watch on Amazon and you go look at the reviews, and there are a bunch of watches that are pretty good and $50 and some for $150, and then there's a couple of watches that are $60 that have 7,000 5-star reviews that all seem legit, including some guy from a Swiss watch lab that said this outperformed 50 watches that were 10 times the price. And this is what we give to all our scuba divers at our diving company. Okay, well, there are things like that for a variety of reasons. It may be that they use the same software stack or the same motherboard as the rad super expensive model, but they've been scaled down for a smaller problem. Maybe they sell this to Home Depot for their core, but they wanted something smaller for their thousands of stores, so they had to deliver that. Well, you kind of get to take advantage of that. A couple of solutions that work for that. Ubiquity networks. They were known for really expensive, really robust point-to-point microwave links you'd put on towers. Well, then they started taking that down into smaller solutions you could use to tie buildings together, maybe a few hundred meters. And now they have a whole line of access points, switches, stuff like that, that still has hardware watchdog and the same firmware stack and the same management software as their big stuff, which is kind of cool. And their stuff seems to work surprisingly well and be less than half the price of comparable solutions that are in the enterprise space. The other way to look for stuff like that, go look around and find stuff that's deployed in thousands of locations. What are they putting in that Starbucks? Or what are wireless ISPs sticking on the pole tops or in the little equipment closets they make their customers provide for them when the signal comes to the building, it has to get distributed out to 5 other floors. A solution called Mikrotik. They make a software router that runs on x86 hardware, and they also make a variety of little embedded solutions that you run on Linksys-like hardware, just MIPS processors in a little box. And they're deployed in the tens of thousands by Wi-Fi providers. And they do really robust things. They have 95% of the features that have ever appeared in Linux or FreeBSD for networky stuff. Quality of service and traffic shaping and VPNs. And they happen to be available. Apparently, one of the reasons they're available cheap is that their large customers sort of get their stuff beta tested by the small appliance customers. And so they have kind of an incentive to keep providing a good product out to the consumer market pretty affordably. Another thing, we talked about scope creep. That's never happened to anybody? Like you've never set out to upgrade the server and ended up in hell? Striving for simplicity, coming up with a plan, I want to have internet, wireless, and 2 terabytes of storage. And maybe sticking to that plan is a good idea. It's so easy to get derailed by shiny and cool technology that you realize it's better to just get a small, functional, feature-complete core of stuff done that solves my problem, take a break, and then come back to that a week or a month later and decide if I want to add more features. That's important. And even in a small environment, even if you have 5 PCs and 2 point-of-sale terminals or a little lab, document everything as if you were deploying a network with 10,000 servers. You have to do that. You can spend just as much time troubleshooting why your grandmother's internet isn't working as you do troubleshooting a problem that's costing thousands of dollars an hour at a client. Something else I've noticed, if you take the time to learn the products and the software and the solutions you're going to deploy, and you know how to back it up properly and to shut it down and start it up properly, and you have it UPS, you have it documented, your uptime with a cheap environment is often better than somebody who has fully redundant, fault-tolerant, expensive environments that does not know how to use them properly. In fact, I will argue that redundant, highly available solutions are dangerous if not handled very, very carefully, because that complexity can interact with itself and cause lots of difficult, mysterious things that take someone smarter than the person who built it to fix when it breaks. I like things that can be fixed by the dumbest guy with a hangover on Monday morning, which is probably me, because I built it. That's me.
There are apparently studies that say that in enterprise environments, about 30% of your outages are due to somebody making a mistake.
I believe that.
An upgrade or something.
I think an important feature, rather than saying I want to have something that will prevent all mistakes or prevent all failures, is I want to draw a box around it, and I want to be able to undo it quickly when I make a mistake. So you earn some plantain chips for that. I'll try not to throw them too hard at you. So buy or build, right? This is a classic hacker question. Why would we buy? We know we're smart. We know we can put things together. We can script. We can write code, whatever. But buying, really, it's a time machine. Do we have the time to do this? Do we need support? Does someone other than myself need to be able to own this after I walk away? Do I want to someday do something else with my life other than support this crappy internet at a coffee shop that I agreed begrudgingly to help 2 years ago when it was broken? And the interchangeability, is there someone other than me? If I pick the most obscure open source package and customize and script the hell out of it, probably nobody but me will ever be able to maintain it. And some people will argue that's job security. I argue that's a way to not sleep for a long time. Now, that being said, when you build it yourself, you do have some advantages. Obviously, you get to save a lot of money. Anything you do yourself, you only invest your time. You can self-maintain it, which might be really important, especially if you're doing something that maybe you want to cookie cutter. Maybe this is a product, you're building a kiosk for malls, and once you get the recipe down, you want to be able to, without any license burdens or overhead or whatever, replicate this over and over, or for other offices. I want to know this thing so backwards and forwards that I can fix anything and I can train someone else and I can document it. I want to have a deep understanding. Maybe I want to use a particular piece of software, a particular piece of hardware that is not exactly click 3 times and run the wizard, because I want to understand it. I want to be able to extend its functionality later, even though I don't need it. Another thing, sustainability. Consumer gear, even enterprise gear, does eventually all fall off the map and become obsolete. Something like my file system with my data on it. It's very concerning to me if, let's say I bought a consumer NAS device and I expect to be able to keep maintaining and moving that forward for 25 years. That might be the life of some of that data that needs to be around. They might very well change vendors, change drive vendors, change file systems. We had to do data recovery for a customer, send it out. They lost some VMs, and it turns out this consumer NAS device they were backing up to had been upgraded 3 or 4 times, and every time they released new firmware, the new volumes came with totally different file system types and layouts and volume permissions, and it got ugly. Do I want to maybe keep something on a vanilla Linux or open source platform that, worst case, I can call up this file and I can compile this 19-year-old junky piece of software that knows how to read and turn this XML file back into a text file if I ever needed to reproduce it. Maybe that's important to me. Maybe if that was a commercial solution, that just would not be obtainable without great expense later. But important thing to keep in mind, your time is not free. I recommend you come up with an hourly rate for your time, and you weigh that against buying it. If I can buy this for $300 and it's going to take 10 hours of my time, is it worth it? Maybe not. So now let's dive into some specific uses or use cases. Excuse me. So UPS's physical infrastructure. This is something I always see people skimp on, even if they buy the most rad, top-of-the-line, awesome technical solution in another category. It's unsexy, it's plumbing. But no piece of IT gear that you depend on should ever be plugged directly into the wall. Lots of reasons. I mean, power surges, you have just the fact that a lot of things are not very friendly to being glitched for a millisecond or a minute. You have downtime, and you have things that don't necessarily come up cleanly or well when they've been glitched. UPSs are expensive to buy brand new, nice ones, but it turns out there's a whole ecosystem around refurbishing and reselling them. So like there's a place in Southern California called UPS Protection. They will get you a nicely refurbished APC unit, I think that's all they sell, or in the smaller units, brand new batteries and like a service contract for about half of what you'd pay for one new, and they'll even deliver it. If you want to do it yourself, you can often call around your clients and colleagues and find some boat anchor that they were going to have to pay to get rid of, and if you agree to haul it away, you can go get batteries from like Power Source in Ontario, rebuild the thing yourself, and be up and running for a few $100 versus say $6,000 for a maybe a multi-kilowatt UPS. It's good to get familiar with how to use, there's a device called a kilowatt, that's K-I-L-L, kilowatt. It's designed for like people who want to go to solar or save power. but find out how much much power your equipment needs, and then size something that has some growth and the runtime you want. It's worth just doing it yourself or hiring a real electrician to put in a couple dedicated circuits where you're going to put your equipment. You really don't want that sharing the circuit with the air conditioner, which is using 80% of that capacity, when it's on, and causing surges when it starts up and shuts down. It's a bad scene. Racks. Putting 19-inch rack gear up, yeah, you can put it in a bread rack, that works, a baker's rack from Costco. But putting it in a proper rack really is a nice thing to do to your equipment, just to keep it clean and orderly and easy to maintain. And those are expensive new, good ones, but they also come up all the time because they're not just used for IT. They're used in telecommunications, they're used in medical, they're used in power plants, and AV places. Any restaurant that has a nice sound system, a bar, any high-end home that has AV equipment, they sell thousands of these like half-height pony racks that are nice and will hold IT equipment just fine. So it's worth just trolling Craigslist for a couple weeks to find something nice, or maybe looking at eBay and something that you can do local pickup on, because it's not worth shipping those things. PDUs, also nice proper rack power strips. Those are worth it. They have much better physical robustness than just a crummy power supply, and they'll screw in. If you look on eBay long enough, you see interesting things. I saw a 42U rack that was a complete DoD certified SCIF. So it was a vault that could hold IT equipment that had power, cooling, and data transfer pass-throughs, and GSA container electronic locks on it. And I think it ended up going for like $1,100, which is basically like the scrap price of the thing. It probably cost $100,000 new. So if you can figure out a way to move the thing, or you have it in front of the pickup truck, you can often get something a lot nicer than you would buy. If you have a small environment, something to think about, if you have a sufficient volume of air to last, say, the weekend when the air conditioning isn't on, you can safely get away with just passively cooling it. Once you have more than a few hundred watts in one place, you have to think about having ventilation at a minimum and probably a real air conditioning system. That's a whole other thing. But keeping things out of just being in a hot little drawer will make them last longer, even if just putting a passive fan in and drilling some holes in and making the cabinet screened and vented. Accessories, little things like cables and rack hardware add up. I recommend maybe not buying that stuff locally unless you're in a pinch, and just ordering bulk 2 or 3 times as many cables and all the links you need. Mono price, or getting better stuff from Graybar or whatever, is not that expensive when you're buying say 50 cables. And buy 50 cables even if you need 20, because it's worth it having factory-made cables the right length that you can label and make nice. M6 hardware is kind of the standard. I recommend only buying racks that have square holes. They can do that. Velcro is also a good way to put awkwardly sized things in. So once we have a maybe physically robust environment to put stuff in, we have stuff we need. What is everyone like for file servers? What have you guys done? Anybody? What?
So I was going to give a shout out to FreeNAS. I had built a four drive system at home running ZFS. Mm-hmm. One of the drives died, never even noticed it, was able to pull it out, put another one in, and just continued humming along. So I was really impressed with just using FreeNAS at home.
That makes sense. Here's some chicharrones for your trouble. Maybe you can pass those back. I'm not going to throw those at you. Let's start with this guy. Maybe you can share them. This is a good point. So consumer devices oftentimes are non-redundant, or they have a very basic hardware RAID 5. ZFS, anything based on ZFS, is going to be automatically out of the gate very, very robust. It may not always be fast depending on how it's deployed, but they write some really advanced checksum information that assumes the hardware itself underlying your file system is untrustworthy and will corrupt your data even while it's not being accessed. And that's why you're able to do that. It probably had, in the past, corrected other errors in that RAID set that might have come up and you never knew it. And when one finally died hard, it still had complete, perfect redundancy across the file system. So that's something to consider. Something in those consumer devices, you don't know what file system. Is it ext3 or 4? Does it have journaling? Is it something else? It may or may not be very kind to being powered off unexpectedly, or a firmware upgrade that doesn't go so great. FreeNAS is probably my go-to for almost any small, medium deployment now where you don't have a lot of money. I used to say do either Solaris or do BSD with ZFS, but ZFS is almost all of the goodness you get with something like NetApp's Waffle in an open source format. File systems are something you don't want to go cheap on. Now, putting that in place, I have a couple of strategies for that. Again, one-use servers are miserable to have in your home or small office, so I recommend doing something like putting a 2-use server or larger chassis in so that you have larger, like 90mm fans that spin slower. I recommend checking the hardware compatibility list for things like FreeBSD and following it to the letter, like not trying to make some bizarre RAID controller that doesn't like to present disks as a just standalone JBOD with no RAID, unless it's done with a special firmware you can only download one place on the phase of the movie, right? Stick to what they say. Stick to the boot drives they say. You boot FreeNAS off of a thumb drive, it works fine. Don't try to make it work. Just get another motherboard or get another server if this one doesn't work. I recommend that 4-drive configuration is kind of a sweet spot, like 4 2TB drives, dual-core 8 GB processor, perhaps a small SLC, like a high write endurance flash for the ZFS logging if you run VMs, and a couple Ethernet ports. Anything more than about 4 SATA class drives, I recommend you go 2 parity drives. The interface, it looks almost exactly like a NetApp or a nice network filer, that was sold in the last 5 years. Really easy to run. This is a system we run at 23B or Hackerspace. We've got one of those half-depth 2U systems, 4 drives, and then we have a 16-bay expansion SAS chassis for it. Underneath there are a couple of VMware servers and then one of those rebuilt UPSs from UPS protection. And that all fits in like a pony rack that was made for AV, and it works great. If you are going to go larger, consider just getting a bigger chassis that can hold the drives internally. Consider getting something that you can add RAM to. And RAM often gets more dear as systems get more expensive, so you might be better off buying that up front, or just going with a motherboard that takes whatever RAM is current. It kind of follows like a reverse bathtub curve, where it's expensive, it goes down, and then when the systems get maybe 5 years old, it gets really expensive again. You're always better off adding RAM to filers than you are things like SSD until you've maxed out the RAM. Another thing, if you have applications, I say virtualize all the things. Pick a hypervisor, get enough RAM. Your things like print services, domain login, any kind of security, network logging, log hosts can all go in VMs, no problem. Try to pick stuff that runs under Linux so you don't have a licensing overhead every time you add a VM. And again, pick something like a desktop chassis, like a beefy CAD workstation that was a couple years old, or a 2U or bigger to minimize the noise. That core switch, buy a good managed layer 3 capable 1 or 10 gig switch depending on your preferences. Cisco stuff, kind of has this allure to it. Everybody, is building a Cisco lab at one time or another in their career. It turns out there are other, top shelf vendors like Arista, Extreme, and Brocade, and when their stuff comes up used, it's oftentimes a lot cheaper than Cisco, even though it's the same or better specs or the same era and vintage. I would recommend getting layer 3, full layer 3 VLANs by port and MAC and so forth up front, even if you don't think you'll need it. That'll help you a lot with virtualization, security stuff you might want to do later. And there are some other tier 2 brands that you're kind of buying maybe the top of the line of the lesser stuff. Dell has some switches that aren't bad. They have one we call I Can't Believe It's Not iOS. Ubiquiti now has a line of switches designed to do power over Ethernet for their wireless gear, and it's surprisingly good. It manages that same GUI. And HP has a whole line of switches which come, if it's one of their smaller edge switches, with a lifetime warranty. No questions asked. So these little Frisbees, these are $65. They work great. Wireless, again, pick your poison, Cisco, Aruba, etc. But those Unifies, I think, are one of those outliers, especially because they come with a really nice free management app that'll run in a Windows or a Linux VM. Just very, very good reliability and price performance. They give you this nice web-based GUI that works under Linux, Windows, etc. for a client. You can have multiple APs, all the stuff you would mostly do in an enterprise environment. Then the last thing, firewalls. I know this is a very personal topic to people here. I think a NAT and a proxy are the minimum you should consider for like a home small office. Some strategies: you can have a like a Dell 990, like a small format PC, you can put in something like a Mikrotik router board. It's a nice little embedded hardware software solution. Or you can consider something like consumer hardware with like DD, OpenWRT, or Tomato to get you that command line and some of those enterprise features unlocked, like VPN tunneling and stuff. I think you're best off picking something and learning it really well and sticking to that if you're going to try and repeat and replicate this. So Mikrotik also has a nice Win32 GUI as well as a CLI and a web GUI. So I kind of like this one. Something that I think is probably the most difficult thing to solve on the cheap is backup. And backup is basically the backup, the backstop to security, storage, other problems you might have. I think you always need to have a copy of your data on-prem and some kind of copy of your data that's offline and not part of your main environment. Small data can be backed up to a cloud service like CrashPlan pretty easily. You have stuff like Time Machine for the Mac that works pretty well. Things like servers and server data, that gets a little more challenging. That might be your crown jewels. Rsync, there are services that will just give you a paid Rsync account like rsync.net. You can rsync a variety of things with scripts offsite. You can also mirror something locally to, say, build a second FreeNAS. That might be a solution if you have hundreds of terabytes of data, wedding photos or video or something you do professionally. You're not going to get that into a fully, Iron Mountain managed offsite DR plan, but you might be able to get that at least to a second one in another room. That would be a big step up. And removable media. You can take that offsite and leave it somewhere. The last thing, other stuff that small businesses tend to spend a lot of money on, things like signage and digital security. There are some nice embedded solutions that use Raspberry Pi and other kinds of cheap open source software hardware. There's a solution called Digital Emotions that will turn any dumb television with an HDMI port and a Raspberry Pi duct taped to the back into a complete digital signage solution. And there's 4 or 5 other ones. The open source security solution we built at 23B. It's a complete RFID and alarm system that's all based on a custom board with a Raspberry Pi on top of it. That's something that if you're willing to get your hands dirty and you could customize something that will work really well for you. And the last thing, uptime. You can't afford a full maintenance contract in HA, but you can do things like maybe purchase 2 of the thing you're going to use on eBay, use one as a lab and dev system before you make a change, and use the other in production. Keep a cold spare of anything you're going to use. Keep it simple. Stick to reference configs, the normal dumb bland way that it's shown in the forums and the tutorials, and take advantage of all the free tools that vendors have. The key is if I have something fail, I want to keep it in a box of I don't want to be down for 3 days. I want to be down for half an hour. If I standardize and keep it simple, I can just keep buying those when they come up, and when someone dies, I just throw it out and put a new one in. If I have the configs and everything backed up, I have my stuff imaged, it's not a big deal. I just want to cry once on purchases like storage and a core network. That's about all I have. I've got some of these links up here, and you can download the presentation here. I think, do we have time for a couple questions?
You have like
2 minutes. 2 minutes. Anybody have anything? Do we actually cover stuff, sort of? Yes, sir.
How concerned are you about anything that's leftover from unused hardware?
Good question. So I always like to wipe all of my hard drives that I get, and I always like to run memtest86 on anything with an x86 processor. I feel like that's adequate. If the tailored access office is after you, I'm not sure that home office solutions are really the realm we're playing in. Any other questions? All right, so for an awesome hat that will make you a pen testing guru. Yes, sir. Matt, what do we have?
Well, I was going to bring up that another source for high reliability hardware is stuff designed for industrial applications, like the computers to put on Caterpillar and so on. And that stuff, it'll be fanless.
This is smart. You get a hat for that because industrial stuff is always needing to be robust, and it's going to live in a dirty environment and get filled with dust. If you have a point of sale solution or something that needs to live in a desk drawer, that's totally a way to go. All right, guys, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.